Well, and the biggest argument on this, which is probably the one that you've had to address or answer the most, is the studies in sub-Saharan Africa on questions of the transmission of HIV/AIDS, and these things that are often used or cited as justifications for why the practice should expand, or as a post hoc justification. Well, we were actually always protecting ourselves when we started this practice in 1870 from a disease that's going to emerge in the 1970s. Um,
Yeah, I
and
mean,
so if you
so
just want to tackle those and the problems that surround them.
sure. I mean, those who think that male circumcision of non-consenting minors should be permissible, uh, who appeal to studies about HIV, uh, act as though if those studies didn't exist, then they'd somehow be opposed to the procedure. But that's not true.
Right.
So it's not a legitimate argument. They don't think that the reason why it's okay to non-consensually alter a child's healthy genitals is because these studies came out in 2005. Okay, the studies themselves were these three, there are actually four randomized control trials. Three of them were looking at the transmission of female to male HIV, and one of them was looking at the transmission of male to female HIV, depending on whether the male had been assigned to a circumcision arm or a control arm. And these were all enrolling adults. So right away, we would have to make a leap from assuming that whatever we think we found in the case of adults applies to neonatal circumcision in like the United States. Whereas these are looking at heterosexual transmission of HIV in sub-Saharan Africa, where heterosexual HIV transmission is a major problem. That's not the case in the United States or England or many other places. And the only effect that they found was a risk reduction in the female to male trials. So males seem to acquire HIV at a lower rate if they were circumcised over the trial period than non-circumcised males. But in the male to female trial, the female partners of circumcised males were contracting HIV at a higher rate. It was actually about the same relative risk increase as was observed as a decrease in the other condition, which sort of makes it look like it would cancel the effect would cancel out. And women in these contexts are much more vulnerable to HIV transmission already. So you should be concerned that the only trials you ever hear about are the successful ones. I mean, kind of like what we are talking about before,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
Well, what we hear about are the ones that worked. The study where they said, oh crap, this doesn't appear to be protecting women. And in fact, the women who are partnered to the circumcised men are getting HIV at a higher rate. They stopped the trial early for futility, and then it just gets buried. Nobody talks about it. But it was the same trial design. And so you'd think that that would be important evidence that we should take into account. So there's lots of things to say. There are problems in the studies themselves. So I could have a long speech just scientifically critiquing the studies. But even if you grant the findings that there's a relative risk reduction female to male only in sub-Saharan Africa as a result of voluntary adult circumcision under these clinical settings where you also have safe sex counseling and free condoms and so forth and a whole bunch of other stuff going on, maybe you can make some argument about whether men in sub-Saharan Africa should be entitled to volunteer for circumcision as part of what they think will help them with HIV transmission. The problem is men aren't signing up in droves for this procedure. And so the advocates on the ground who are trying to meet their quotas are starting to fudge the details a little bit. And they're starting to imply to many of these men that circumcision is actually kind of like a vaccine that will make them immune to HIV so that they don't have to wear condoms anymore. And the men go, oh, well, I mean, I guess if I don't have to wear condoms, that would be a reason for me to cut off part of my penis. So I guess I'll do that. But of course, the problem is if you're not wearing condoms, your risk of transmission increases. So you have what's called risk compensation. There's a whole bunch of debates about whether this is seen generally in some contexts, not in others, and so forth. But you have lots of reports of men believing that they're now immune to HIV. And so they engage in more sexually risky behaviors, which is not a good thing. Even accepting all that stuff, the idea that these data can be applied to newborn circumcision in countries that do not have heterosexual epidemics of HIV, where HIV is primarily transmitted among men who have sex with men, for which there's no evidence of any protective effect of circumcision, and among injecting drug users.
Mm-hmm.
There's like so many assumptions that you would have to test that haven't been tested. It's just this like, I heard that circumcision is good for HIV, so that's a further reason why we should do it here in the United States. That's about the quality of the inference that's being drawn. And it's like, there's no evidence that these data, even if you accept them, are applicable to a different epidemiological environment, a different form of circumcision. And anyway, there's an important ethical difference between these cases, which is if you volunteer to have part of your penis removed because you think it's going to help you, then like, God bless you. But if you perform a surgery on somebody who cannot refuse, that just raises some really important ethical questions that people just gloss over when they make these kind of bland medicalized appeals to HIV data.
Well, and to say nothing of the fact that in a lot of these cases, or far too many of the cases, there are plenty of these cultures in these parts of Africa that are not historically circumcising cultures. And basically, this is a kind of, I don't want to even call it soft, but it is the edge, pardon the pun, of sort of Western imperialism that's sort of reasserting itself through this kind of medicalization of tissue.
So this is a real issue. So like the Luo of Kenya, for example, traditionally don't circumcise either boys or girls. And that's a point of pride for them. It's like part of their ethnic identity for, I don't know, however many generations going back, they don't circumcise. And they're often attacked by members of other tribes in Kenya on political grounds. And they're treated in a prejudicial manner because they don't circumcise. And then these American do-gooders come in and say, we've got this medical thing. It's called circumcision. You should just everybody in your group should do it. And they're like, yeah, sorry, it's like deeply ethnically part of our identification that we don't circumcise. It's not just a neutral thing here that you're offering to us. This isn't a vaccine. You're talking about a genital modification that has cultural significance in our context. And if you want to start to look into the way in which these biomedical advocates have run roughshod over cultural distinctions, ethnic identifications, just respect for local people and their attitudes toward something that's clearly not just like a vaccination, but is a surgery on a psychosexually sensitive part of the body with cultural implications. It's just shocking. Also, I mean, I don't know. I was just listening to the Afghanistan papers, which is kind of this reporting that's come out over the last 20 years of US military intervention in Afghanistan. And when you just realize the like total inability for the military mindset to actually understand what it would be like to respectfully engage with people who have different cultural values and to understand their cultural systems and what matters to them and to treat them like equals. It's just shocking. It's just horrible. But unfortunately, the biomedical mindset is similar to the military mindset, which is it's very myopic. It's like, we've got one thing we're trying to sell here, more circumcisions, because we think that will lead to less HIV and that's all that matters. And it's like, no, there's other things that matter as well. And anyway, it's not clear that your intervention is working because you got this data from clinical trials. And that's efficacy data. That's not the same thing as effectiveness data that shows it's going to work in the real world and you have to deal with things like cultural structures. And so that could be a whole podcast unto itself. It's like a nightmare what's happening right now in terms of US funded intervention for mass circumcision of African men and boys, which by the way, they're doing younger and younger boys. So it's like boys who are 10, 11, 12, often without the consent of their parents or even the awareness of their parents. Because again, the local officials are trying to get paid to meet their quotas. The men aren't signing up enough, so then they're targeting younger and younger boys. Now, regardless of your view about all the different kind of complexities of the ethical stuff here, most people would say that at the very least, the parents would have to give some sort of proxy permission or consent for it to be ethically valid. Nobody thinks you can just walk up to a young boy and cut off part of his penis because everyone accepts that he can't consent if he's 10 or 11, or certainly if not if he's a baby. So if you cut somebody's body without any form of consent, that's just an assault. That's like a crime. And so there's evidence that in Kenya alone, there's been 35,000 such cases of unconsented by anybody circumcisions of young boys. And just imagine the trauma of this. If you're an 11-year-old and you're in school and somebody's like, you need this thing, it's like a drive-by van that comes in through the village. They're really eager and they kind of give you a story that's good for sexual health. Maybe you've never even had sex before. Maybe you don't even know what's at stake here. Your pants get pulled down. Somebody performs a surgery on your genitals that your parents don't even know about. And this is happening like not once or twice, but again, in the case of thousands in just this one area of Kenya that I happen to know about because there was a research study that was done there. I don't know how often it's happening in other contexts. So that's like thousands of genital sexual assaults with a knife that are happening. And I haven't read anything in the New York Times about this. I haven't read anything in the BBC about this. I haven't read anything in the popular media discussion about this. So researchers are aware that this is going on. And you can tell from my animated way of speaking that I'm pretty incensed about this. So, I don't know. That's a whole conversation we can have. But you're right. It's not just a neutral biomedical intervention where we're just like going and offering this lovely service to these Africans to, help them with their HIV. We're doing it in a completely roughshod way with no sensitivity to the cultural context in which it's being done and with major negative externalities that are not part of the media conversation about this for some reason.
Well, that's pretty absurd. And it's not only shallow, but I think it shows a serious, not misunderstanding of what the term is. It may show a serious horizon for what the term can be. What we may need to have more of is like cultural respect, not an attempt at creating sort of cultural hegemony and calling it multiculturalism.
Yeah, when it's over 25 million circumcisions now that have been done primarily among traditionally non-circumcising groups, where again that's often part of their cultural identity. And the thing is that these African men are being remade in the image of the medically modified American penis.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just being, again, I think Americans don't think of their cultural practice as a cultural practice. That's the whole point of when you're a powerful group, is that the norms that are familiar to you become invisible because you're not exposed to the power impositions of other groups that are questioning your practice. I mean, again, these Muslims from Malaysia who I mentioned, who practice female circumcision as well as male circumcision, they're certainly aware of the fact that they're being criticized from Westerners for supposedly mutilating their daughters. And when they ask really straightforward questions like, why do you call what we do to our daughters mutilation when it's less severe than what we do to our sons, which you accept? And then the Westerners don't have a good answer to that. They're like, well, because I don't know, because it's bad and we don't do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's like, we in the West don't have the same incentive to question our cultural practices. And so when we go into Africa and we circumcise 25 million men, we just think we're giving them medicine. It doesn't occur to us that we're like imposing our cultural norm on them. So what you find in many such cases is that when the men object, they change the policy and they say you should target infant boys because infant boys cannot refuse.
And then there's the more powerful PR leverage, which is women won't want to have sex with you if you don't. And
yeah, that's being used as part of the propaganda campaigns in sub-Saharan Africa now, funded by like UNAIDS and stuff like that, where they'll have these images of African women being like, "Oh my God, you're not circumcised? Like, why would I want to sleep with you?" So, I mean, what we would call that in a different discourse is like body shaming of vulnerable youths who are just coming into their sexuality, trying to figure out if anybody likes them or so forth. And now they're getting like U.S. government paid for advertisements suggesting that their surgically unmodified body is dirty, is disgusting, is something that will cause them to rightly be ostracized from their community. There's even some sense that maybe they're actually kind of being dangerous and that they have a responsibility to have their genitals modified to protect other people and so forth, without worrying about whether there's evidence in that community that this procedure actually has effectiveness in reducing HIV. It's just all based on these modeling exercises from the original clinical trials. And then you have this whole propaganda campaign that comes in that's stigmatizing genitally unmodified boys as disgusting. And this is something that it's like there are ethical reasons to think that the way to get a young person to volunteer for the medicine you're offering them is not to sexually shame them for their bodies.
And the thing that is flabbergasting, I mean, there are two of them, but the one that's really flabbergasting is once you set up this precedent and people come to know that what you've been selling to them is bullshit, when you come with something that's more serious, like imagine that there could be sort of an airborne pandemic that shuts down the world for 18 months, and you walk in and go, we have a treatment for this, get out. I remember you from the last time, why would I trust anything that comes forward from you again?
This is already happening. There's lots of discussion among men and women in these villages who say, for example, they'll say, yeah, my cousin got circumcised and then he thought he didn't have to wear condoms and then he got HIV and then he got AIDS and then he died. But they came in here and said we had to do this. This was going to protect us from HIV. And then now suppose the same people come in and say, oh, we've got this vaccine to help you with COVID-19. This same community is like, what are you talking about? You lied to us before, or at least that's how that they'll conceive of it. And so, yeah, there's not a consideration for what it actually means to build trust with the community, which requires understanding how your medical intervention is going to be received in cultural terms. And it also requires having your data straight. This is the other thing too. This mass campaign was launched on the basis of clinical efficacy data, not translational research showing that it was effective in the real world. And by the way, the real world is very different depending on which ethnic context you're talking about in Africa. What is the social and structural and medical institutional environment of the specific part that you're talking about? You're going to get different results. But so normally you would do translational research to make sure the thing works in the real world. But this is just done based on modeling exercises. I mean, it's just crazy.